October 25, 1944. Dawn breaks over the Philippine Sea east of Samar Island. Aboard the bridge of the Fletcher-class destroyer USS Johnston, Commander Ernest Evans stands at the helm of his ship, steam rising from his coffee cup as the morning watch reports all quiet. The Johnston is part of a tiny escort screen protecting 6 slow escort carriers. Their mission is simple: provide air support for General Douglas MacArthur's troops landing on Leyte. No one expects surface combat. No one expects what is about to come over the horizon. Then a lookout screams, "Pagoda masts." Japanese pagoda masts, 4 of them, then cruiser silhouettes, then destroyers. An entire Japanese battle fleet is bearing down on them at 30 knots. At the center of that fleet looms the largest battleship ever built, the Yamato, displacing nearly 72,000 tons, armed with 9 18.1-inch guns, capable of hurling 3,200-pound shells more than 26 miles. The Yamato alone weighs more than every ship in the American task unit combined. What follows will become one of the most celebrated last stands in naval history. And at its heart will be a single destroyer, a Cherokee commander who refused to run, and one of the most audacious charges ever attempted at sea. This is the story of USS Johnston. To understand why Johnston charged into the teeth of a Japanese armada, you must first understand what was at stake that October morning. The American invasion of the Philippines had begun 5 days earlier. 130,000 soldiers and Marines were ashore on Leyte Island, still consolidating their beachheads, still vulnerable. Supply ships and transport vessels crowded the Gulf behind them. If a Japanese surface fleet broke through to those beaches, the slaughter would be catastrophic. The entire liberation of the Philippines could unravel in a single morning. The Japanese knew this. Their plan, codenamed Sho-Go One, was designed to exploit exactly this vulnerability. While a decoy carrier force lured Admiral William Halsey's powerful Third Fleet northward, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force would slip through San Bernardino Strait and descend upon the invasion beaches from the north. It was a desperate gamble, but Japan was desperate. The war in the Pacific was slipping away, and Leyte represented perhaps the last chance to turn the tide. The night before the battle, Kurita's force had taken punishment. American submarines had torpedoed 2 of his cruisers. Carrier aircraft had sunk the superbattleship Musashi with 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs. But Kurita pressed on. He still commanded 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. His flagship Yamato carried guns whose shells weighed as much as a small automobile. Halsey took the bait. Convinced the center force had been neutralized, he raced north with his entire fleet to chase Ozawa's decoy carriers. He left San Bernardino Strait completely unguarded. Nothing stood between Kurita and the invasion beaches except 3 small escort carrier groups known by their radio call signs: Taffy 1, Taffy 2, and Taffy 3. Taffy 3, under Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, was the northernmost unit and directly in Kurita's path. It consisted of 6 escort carriers built on merchant ship hulls, capable of only 18 knots at maximum speed. 3 Fletcher-class destroyers screened them: Hull, Heermann, and Johnston. 4 smaller destroyer escorts completed the formation. These ships were designed to hunt submarines, not to fight battleships. Their largest guns were 5-inch weapons that fired 54-pound shells. They could not penetrate the armor of a heavy cruiser at any range. Against the Yamato, they might as well have been throwing rocks. When Admiral Sprague received the contact report at 6:46 that morning, he initially refused to believe it. The silhouettes on the horizon had to be friendly ships. Then colored geysers erupted around his carriers: pink, green, yellow, blood red. Each Japanese battleship used different colored dye in their shells to identify their fall of shot. The enemy was real, and they were already firing. Sprague ordered his carriers to turn east into the wind and launch aircraft. He called for smoke screens. He sent out desperate radio calls for help that would take hours to arrive. And he gave an order that seemed like suicide: small boys attack. Before the order even came through, Commander Ernest Edwin Evans had already made his decision. Ernest Evans was born in Pawnee, Oklahoma, on August 13, 1908. He was of Cherokee and Creek descent, a Native American who had beaten extraordinary odds just to become a naval officer in an era of intense prejudice. He enlisted in the Navy in 1926, then earned an appointment to the Naval Academy at Annapolis. His classmates called him the Chief, partly for his heritage and partly for his natural leadership. He was stocky, broad-shouldered, with straight black hair and dark eyes that missed nothing. By October 1944, Evans was 36 years old and had already seen more combat than most officers twice his age. He had served aboard the destroyer Alden during the disastrous Battle of the Java Sea in February 1942, one of the worst Allied naval defeats of the war. He had watched as Japanese forces systematically destroyed the combined American, British, Dutch, and Australian fleet. The Alden survived only by retreating, and that experience burned in Evans ever after. He swore he would never run from a fight again. When the Navy gave him command of the newly commissioned Johnston in October 1943, Evans made a speech to his assembled crew that would become legendary. "This is going to be a fighting ship," he told them. "I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now." It was a quote borrowed from John Paul Jones, the father of the American Navy, and Evans meant every word. The Johnston was a Fletcher-class destroyer, the finest destroyer design America produced during the war. At 376 feet long and displacing roughly 2,500 tons fully loaded, she was fast, maneuverable, and well armed for her size. Her main battery consisted of 5.5-inch 38 caliber guns in single mounts, capable of firing 15 rounds per minute each. She carried 10 21-inch torpedo tubes in 2 quintuple mounts, loaded with the Mark 15 torpedo. For anti-aircraft defense, she mounted Bofor's 40mm guns and Oerlikon 20mm cannons. 2 General Electric geared steam turbines generated 60,000 shaft horsepower, giving her a top speed of 38 knots. The Fletcher-class represented a quantum leap over earlier American destroyer designs. Previous classes had been cramped and top-heavy, forcing the Navy to remove weapons and equipment during wartime refits just to maintain stability. The Fletchers were larger, more stable, and built with room to grow. The Navy commissioned 175 of them between 1942 and 1944, more than any other destroyer class in history. They served almost exclusively in the Pacific, where their long range and heavy armament proved invaluable. But even a Fletcher-class destroyer was hopelessly outmatched against what was bearing down on Taffy Three that morning. The Yamato's main battery turrets each weighed more than an entire Fletcher-class destroyer. Her armor belt was 16 inches thick at the waterline, more than 2 feet thick on her gun turrets. The shells from Johnston's 5-inch guns could not have scratched her paint at any range. None of that mattered to Ernest Evans. At 6:50, Johnston received word of the approaching Japanese fleet. Evans did not wait for orders. He did not ask permission. He simply acted. "All hands to general quarters," he announced over the ship's intercom. "Prepare to attack a major portion of the Japanese fleet. All engines ahead flank. Commence making smoke and stand by for a torpedo attack. Left full rudder." Johnston charged. Her gunnery officer, Lieutenant Robert Hagen, later recalled feeling like little David without a slingshot. As Johnston raced toward the enemy, Hagen watched the Japanese ships grow larger through his rangefinder. 4 battleships, 7 cruisers. At least 12 destroyers. The pagoda masts of the Japanese battle wagons towered against the morning sky like fortresses. Johnston laid smoke as she charged, her funnels belching thick black clouds to screen the fleeing carriers behind her. Enemy shells began falling around her, throwing up enormous geysers of colored water. The battleship Nagato fired a full salvo from her 16-inch guns. The Haruna unleashed her 6-inch secondary battery. Somehow, impossibly, every shot missed. At 7:10, Johnston came within range. Hagen singled out the heavy cruiser Kumano, leading a column of cruisers, and opened fire. Johnston's 5 guns roared in unison, pouring shells at the rate of 1 per second. Over the next 5 minutes, Johnston fired more than 200 rounds, striking Kumano at least 45 times. Hagen knew his shells could not penetrate the cruiser's armor, so he aimed for the bridge and superstructure, setting fires, killing gun crews, shattering equipment. Then Evans closed to 10,000 yards and fired all 10 torpedoes. The Mark 15 torpedo carried a 600-pound warhead and ran at 46 knots on its high-speed setting. Johnston's spread raced toward the Japanese cruiser line. At least one torpedo struck Kumano squarely on the starboard bow. The explosion was catastrophic. It blew off the cruiser's entire bow section, forcing her out of the battle. Her sister ship Suzuya fell back to escort the crippled Kumano and would later be knocked out of action entirely by American air attacks while attempting to assist. In a matter of minutes, a single destroyer had crippled a heavy cruiser and disrupted the entire Japanese cruiser column. But Johnston had not escaped unscathed. At 7:30, as Evans maneuvered to escape back toward the carriers, the battleship Yamato finally found her range. Yamato's fire control computers had been tracking what they identified as an American cruiser. At 20,300 yards, she fired a full broadside from her 9 18-inch guns. 3 shells struck Johnston almost simultaneously. The 18-inch armor-piercing rounds were designed to penetrate the belt armor of enemy battleships. Johnston had no armor to speak of. The shells punched clean through her unarmored hull without detonating, their fuses designed for thick steel that simply was not there. But the damage was still catastrophic. The shells tore through her engine rooms, severed steam lines, destroyed electrical cables, and knocked out power to 3 of her 5 gun turrets. Her speed dropped from 35 knots to 17. Seconds later, 3 6-inch shells from Yamato's secondary battery found their mark. One struck amidships, destroying an anti-aircraft director. 2 more hit forward, shredding the bridge, wounding dozens of men, and blowing off 2 of Commander Evans's fingers along with his entire shirt. Evans refused medical attention. Bleeding and half-naked, he directed damage control parties as Johnston limped into a nearby rain squall for cover. Within 10 minutes, his crew had restored power to the forward guns and patched what they could. The 3rd gun turret was disconnected from fire control and would have to be operated manually by its crew. Then Evans did something that defied all military logic. He turned around and went back into the fight. By 7:50, Rear Admiral Sprague had ordered his remaining destroyers and destroyer escorts to make torpedo attacks against the pursuing Japanese fleet. The Hole and Heermann were just beginning their runs. The destroyer escorts Raymond, Dennis, John C. Butler, and Samuel B. Roberts were forming up behind them. Evans saw them heading in and decided that Johnston, despite her crippling damage, despite having already expended all her torpedoes, would accompany them. "We're going back in," he announced. Johnston fell in behind the other destroyers, providing fire support with her remaining guns. She exchanged salvos with the heavy cruiser Haguro. She fired on the battleship Haruna. At 8:20, spotting the battleship Congo just 7,000 yards distant, she poured 30 shells into the giant warship within a single minute, forcing Congo to maneuver away. Then Evans saw something that demanded immediate action. The escort carrier Gambier Bay, slowest of the slow escort carriers, had fallen behind the formation. She was dead in the water, listing to port, with Japanese cruisers closing in for the kill. One of those cruisers, the Chikuma, was preparing to deliver the finishing blow. Evans gave what his gunnery officer later called the most courageous order I have ever heard. "Commence firing on that cruiser, draw her fire on us and away from Gambier Bay." Johnston opened fire on Chikuma, scoring 4 hits before the cruiser broke off her attack on the crippled carrier and turned her 8-inch guns on the impudent destroyer instead. For precious minutes, Evans kept Chikuma occupied, buying time for Gambier Bay's crew to abandon ship. It was a delaying action, nothing more. Gambier Bay would sink at 9:11 that morning, but many of her crew survived because Johnston had drawn away the killing blow. Then the Japanese destroyer squadron appeared. The light cruiser Yahagi, accompanied by several destroyers, had circled around the American formation and was now preparing a torpedo attack against the fleeing carriers. These were modern, fast destroyers, roughly equal in firepower to Johnston herself. But Johnston was barely making 15 knots on one engine, with only 2 operational guns and no torpedoes remaining. Evans attacked anyway. He drove Johnston straight into the middle of the enemy destroyer column, guns blazing. His fire was so accurate and so unexpected that the entire Japanese formation broke off its attack run. Yahagi and her destroyers turned away, forced to launch their torpedoes at extreme range where they had no chance of hitting anything. The carriers escaped unharmed. But now Johnston was surrounded. The Japanese destroyers recovered and turned their guns on the wounded American ship. Shell after shell slammed into Johnston, methodically destroying what remained. Her main mast collapsed. Her last engine died. Her remaining guns were smashed into silence. Fires burned throughout the ship. The bridge became untenable from smoke and explosions. Evans moved his command to the fantail, where he shouted steering orders through an open hatch to sailors below, who turned the rudder by hand. Even then, with his ship dying around him, he continued to fight. At 9:45, with no power, no weapons, and no hope of salvation, Evans finally gave the order to abandon ship. Johnston had been fighting for nearly 3 hours straight. It was the last time anyone saw Commander Evans. Severely wounded, bare-chested, still directing his ship through smoke and fire, he remained at his post as his crew went over the side. At 10:10, Johnston rolled over and sank. As Johnston slipped beneath the waves, something remarkable happened. A Japanese destroyer approached to point-blank range, not to fire a killing shot, but to render honors. Her crew lined the deck at attention. Her captain stood on the bridge wing and saluted as the American destroyer went down. Survivors in the water watched in astonishment as their enemies paid tribute to the ship that had fought them with such ferocity. Commander Ernest Evans was not among those survivors. His body was never recovered. He was declared missing in action and later presumed dead. Of Johnston's complement of 327 men, 186 died, including many who survived the sinking only to succumb to sharks, exposure, and dehydration during 2 days adrift before rescue came. What Johnston and her sisters accomplished that morning at Samar was nothing short of miraculous. 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts, supported by aircraft from the escort carriers, had turned back a Japanese battle fleet that outweighed them more than 20-1. Kurita's force lost 3 heavy cruisers sunk and 3 more damaged. The battleships Yamato, Nagato, Haruna, and Kongo sustained varying degrees of damage from near misses and strafing attacks. More importantly, the relentless American attacks had convinced Kurita that he was facing a much larger force than actually existed. Believing he was engaged with fleet carriers and heavy cruisers, he ordered his battered ships to withdraw at 9:25 that morning. The invasion beaches at Leyte were saved. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, later wrote that the success of Taffy Three was nothing short of special dispensation from the Lord Almighty. Historians have called it one of the greatest last stands in naval history. Commander Ernest Evans was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, becoming the first Native American in the history of the United States Navy to receive the nation's highest military decoration. His citation praised his indomitable courage and brilliant professional skill, and noted that he aided materially in turning back the enemy during a critical phase of the action. Johnston herself received the Presidential Unit Citation, along with every ship and aircraft of Taffy Three. She was credited with 6 battle stars for her service in the Pacific. A destroyer escort, USS Evans, was later named in honor of her commander. In 2021, researchers aboard the deep-sea submersible limiting factor located Johnston's wreck more than 21,000 feet below the surface of the Philippine Sea, at the edge of the Philippine Trench. It was the deepest shipwreck ever surveyed at that time. Her hull number, 557, remained clearly visible on her bow, bright white against the dark steel. Her forward guns still pointed toward starboard, in the direction of the enemy ships she had fought to the last. The Johnston lies there still, a monument to raw courage, to defiance in the face of impossible odds, to a Cherokee commander who promised his crew he would go in harm's way and never back down from that promise. On the morning of October 25, 1944, a destroyer that had no business attacking a battle fleet attacked anyway. She bought time with her blood, she saved lives with her sacrifice, and she taught the Japanese Navy a lesson that resonates through history. The size of the fight in the dog matters more than the size of the dog in the fight. USS Johnston. Hull number DD557. Gone but never forgotten.